Our next paper will be presented by Joyce Townsend, who is the senior conservation scientist at the Tate with a background in physics and a PhD in technical art history. Joyce performs research on microfading and paint analysis, and I welcome you now.
All right, good afternoon. Right. This is a project which is still ongoing. This is an interim report on what we've found so far. This is the single collage by Picasso in our collection. It was being examined because it is now committed to 2 loans and displays. And once it has had some exposure internationally, other loan requests tend to come in. We wanted to assess its fragility and to work out ways of making it safe to travel. It consists of printed paper and ink on paper. Picasso retained it in his possession until around 1941. And Tate acquired it in 1961. We think it was in private ownership between these dates, and we're still trying to investigate the history. So here's the work: bottle of Vieuxmark, glass guitar, and newspaper. And originally was dated to 1912 by Zervos in his catalogue, is now thought to be 1913 in date. It has what is possibly its earliest frame. It's in the style used by Kahnweiler, Picasso's dealer, in the 1950s, because we have no evidence now that it was framed when Picasso owned it. There have been parallel and previous studies by Elizabeth Cowling at the University of Edinburgh, who has looked at the wallpaper and other found material which Picasso was using in the several collages he made just in the years around 1912 and 13, which she has published, and she has also been working with us and has examined the collage. And she has been telling us about some others which she has seen. For example, there is one in Düsseldorf, Germany, very different in appearance colour-wise, but significantly, as I'll be showing, there are changes to the components of the collage. The newspaper which Picasso used in this one is from the same edition of Le Figaro, which was of 1889, so it was an old newspaper when he used it, about 25 years old. And one suggestion is he chose that particular date to make a political comment. So their paper is very damaged in appearance, but was already aged when used. And many of the others he was working on in this period are very blue, either in the components they contain or in the support paper for the background, much more strongly coloured blue than ours. For example, this one in the Museo Nacional Picasso. And there is an example bottle of newspaper in the National Gallery of Ireland, which contains some similar elements to ours, which are a kind of printing pattern piece, of which I have some examples, not as old as those Picasso would have used, but I will leave them at the front. These are not free gifts. My colleagues would like them back to work on. But the pattern pieces looked like this. They were printed, and the idea was to iron them onto the fabric and use them as a design for embroidering. In this example of the collage in Ireland, there is hardly any pattern left, hardly any colour. They were mostly blue of various kinds and probably made of different dyes in production. They often came free in women's magazines. And this collage also has a wallpaper, a ready varnished wallpaper, and it was torn and damaged, and it's been speculated that Picasso pulled it off a wall and used it. And the newspaper is darkened. The Tate collage was illustrated in the Zervos catalogue, presumably when still belonging to Picasso. So it would have been photographed about 1940 at the latest. And you can see the two elements which correspond to the pattern pieces. There's a very strong and contrasty pattern. And there's a lot of contrast between the print and the paper in the newsprint elements. It is, of course, a black and white photograph. The paper support is a good quality paper. It's a handmade paper. It's laid. It's made by Fabriano, and it has the watermark. And interestingly, it has quite a lot of pinholes in all the corners, so Picasso may well have displayed it in his studio or elsewhere by pinning on the wall. We recently put this new image into the presentation. You can see here, but not so clearly, that the protected edge has retained more blue colour. There's quite significant colour loss to the blue paper support, but assuming it was already displayed by Picasso, perhaps for some decades, we may already be looking at a thing that was faded overall. My colleague Charity is making handmade paper with indigo-dyed fibres and added indigo in order to do reconstructions, and I have some examples of her papers here. We're assuming that the original background colour could have been quite significantly blue and more like these. In fact, the only component of the collage that we're not concerned about in terms of potential for fading is the black Chinese-style ink, which he applied last over the other collage elements. Here you can get a better idea of the degree of fading that there has been. This is the top left edge where protected from light by the frame that's been probably on there since the 1950s. That's a close-up detail of the blue paper where it's protected. It's coloured with blue fibres and lilac fibres, and where it's been faded by light, the lilac fibres have survived better than the blue, so there's probably been a colour shift. There's also a few blue and red fibres. And there are many deformations on the paper, probably from the time of its construction. Because you had to iron the pattern pieces with a hot iron onto paper, we also think that the individual paper elements were pasted and ironed on rather than simply pressed on gently, hence the deformations in the paper. And this is a detail of one of the papers that had the pattern piece ironed on, and here again is evidence for very significant colour loss where it's been protected and then exposed to light. And you can see, in fact, that the white paper is slightly more yellow, and there are the details. We haven't tried, and we don't think it would be easy to analyse the dye, nor would it be perhaps very useful to know, because we have no known examples of pattern pieces of such an early date as yet. The green element in the composition is unusual. You don't see greens in the others of this period, you see blues. It seems to be a flocked wallpaper. That means it was a paper which was coated with a wet coating. It's shellac-based from analysis. And then chopped coloured fibres would be shaken over so they would lightly adhere. And they do very lightly adhere. When you look closely at it, it's got a bright turquoise background colour, which had the adhesive layer in it, and it's been retouched in many places, quite possibly by Picasso himself. In appearance, it looks like artist paint, where you see the retouchings. It may have been that these were existing holes already, like moth damage, if the paper was already an old one when he used it. Interestingly, the earliest retouchings on there are dark blue, followed by turquoise blue, followed by green, which suggests perhaps a dramatic colour change as well. It's an animal hair fibre for the flock. It's probably wool. We're still working on that, which would be very prone to insect damage. And so we're doing microfading on it. This is the first round, just completed in time for this conference. We do intend to do more. This is the broad setup for microfading. Clearly that is not the Picasso under there, but this is the general method. You expose a small area to a very high intensity light for a short period, in our case 10 or 15 minutes, while measuring the colour in live time, stopping sooner should there be any significant colour change. And it's quite a small scale spot. Well, ours is at the large spot size for microfading, but just appropriate for these small things. So there is a piece of pattern, and the green, of course, was the challenge to microfade. It's highly textured and it's highly variable in colour, which does suggest it's undergone changes. With microfading, you normally compare to something, the blue wool standards, which I'm showing here. In each of these graphs, this is blue wool 1, very fugitive, blue wool 2, somewhat better, blue wool 3. You would hope that any of the areas being microfaded in the artwork would be at least as light stable as blue wool 3. In other words, we don't want them any higher than this, but they are. The newsprint appears to show a lot of colour change, but that's because it's yellowed, it's bleaching. The blue support, both the faded areas and the protected areas, do show some colour change, as does the dye on the pattern pieces, as does the green element, both its background turquoise colour, which includes Prussian blue, and the green, or now green, fibres. The only elements with less colour change are the grey paper and the brown paper. We did have some slight concerns that the grey paper had faded too grey, but we think perhaps not. So we have formulated some research questions, and we have some answers, which I'm showing here as the summary. I've also thought of some more research questions just by coming here today. So one question was whether a fragility due to the construction is a barrier to lending or to travelling. And it seems no, it is pretty well made, and the components are adhering quite safely. We don't even need to carry out any consolidation, really. The next key question was, is it still light sensitive? or has most of the fading occurred already? And yes, both the blue paper and the blue ink, but other components, are very sensitive, more sensitive than a lot of the works and paper in our collection. So what illuminance might we recommend? We're thinking, saying a maximum of 1 year in 4. Normally we would display works for 2 years in 4 if they are of typical light sensitivity for paper. The green wallpaper, we're still investigating, one that was retouched. And did he do this because he already saw the colour change? Quite possibly. We're not sure if we'll be able to find out any more about that, but we shall try. It's also the most fragile component because the wool fibres are very weak and brittle now. Was that brown paper more red? Unlikely. Was the grey one different? We think probably not, even though we don't see greys in others. The newspaper, we do think is now much darker, not least because there is an old repair and infill here, probably done while it was at Tate, done in the 70s or the 80s, which seems to be quite stable and hasn't changed while the newspaper has darkened round it. It's pretty hard to assess any damage following travel or loan because we are looking at already damaged newsprint and wallpaper. We will continue to frame it. We don't have the dilemma that we otherwise could have whether or not to display the edges, which are protected. They are protected by the frame that may be original, so we will continue to frame it in that way. And we hope to continue with our assessment of it, its making and its construction and its appearance. Thank you. And I'll leave these down here for you to look at if you would like.
Thank you very much for that really interesting talk. Are there any questions?
Joyce, do you recall the light intensity when you were doing your light studies, when you were using the microphagometer?
I think it's about a megalux.
How many?
We're recalibrating it. At its best, it's about a megalux.
Megalux.
It's probably less right now.
And did you do any reciprocity studies when you were doing that test?
We probably won't do any on this work because there are limited areas to work on. We have done earlier reciprocity studies with that microfader and with blue wools and with Prussian blue, yes. And it seemed not to be so intense as to really to exceed reciprocity. As among microfaders, it's not the most intense of them because it has a large spot size.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? I have one. With the difference being so great in the faded areas and the protected areas, has there been any thought of recreating the original color virtually for an exhibition?
We might. We are more thinking of actually trying to do physical reconstructions that could form part of an exhibition.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Okay.
Anything else? Well, thank you very, very much.